Thank you all very, very much. And it's great to always be back in Cape Town, even though it was so hot yesterday. Maybe there was some climate change going on. I've been through, in my own life, quite a massive sea change in the last few years, and I think it's causing me to look at some of my own research a little bit differently. So I'm going to play on a few words. I know some people in the room don't like the word co-designing. They prefer co-creating, but I think we're open to co-anything, as long as it's co. So what I'd like to do is to reflect a bit on what Tom Downing has been doing, which I think is quite useful. I'm going to talk about our traditions of practice, us sitting in the room, and not necessarily the practice communities out there to start off with. So over time, you can see that we've had a very interesting impacts agenda that's dominated most of climate change, particularly from the early 90s to now. So a climate event happens and it produces an outcome. Then in the late 1990s, we had the first generation or era of vulnerability assessments, where we were really looking, I think, as a community at outcome vulnerability. That was followed by the next wave or era of generational vulnerability coming from an internal understanding, so people's structure and agency and how that frames vulnerability. And finally, we've come in now to what I would call, and what Karen I think would call, and Mark and others, which is a transformative agenda. So I think it's useful for people who are perhaps newer into this community for us to just get a sense of where we've come from over time. And it's also quite interesting to position our long-term mitigation strategies as a country and our long-term adaptation strategies onto that continua. But I'm going to come back to these traditions of practice, our own traditions of practice over time. So I've been very fortunate to engage with a range of people, and I really valued the previous interjection where someone said, we aren't talking to the people we should be talking to. We tend to talk amongst ourselves, and we talk about the stakeholders out there. I've been very fortunate to work with a bunch of very interesting people, and they're not a bunch, they're a really interesting group of people working on a project called RIASCO, which is driven by FAO, and it was assessing 14 countries in the Southern African region to have a look at the humanitarian challenges that have been faced in that region. And much like Shiona and Gina and the other panel have said, you can see that it's complex. There are multiple drivers, multiple stresses going into the system, and that's useful because it's part of that era or that way of thinking, but by doing that, it actually frames some of the interventions you might want to make, in other words, some of the resilience builders. But the thing that I want to leave you with as I take you along my narrative or journey is that we worked with a very different group of people. These were humanitarian agents who actually have a wealth of data, and by just engaging with them, we started to open up our own discourse and our own, if you like, vision or blind spot started to get shifted. So just to show you some of the results, because it's not the purpose of my talk to go into this. I've done this previously, and I'll give you the web link if you want. It's a fantastic, I think, document. But what came out of this very hardcore analysis of these 14 countries over a decade or more was that of all the humanitarian disasters that occurred and the emergencies, when we had intervention, 37 of those were linked to a definite environmental threat. And you can see that flood-related issues became a huge burden of concern, requiring massive interventions. So from that data set, and this is what's quite interesting, which I'll come back to in a minute, you can see that by working with a different group of people, we were able to plot and map out a different sense of, or categorization of disasters. So when you go to the CRED or the official databases, you tend to get a gross underestimation of these kinds of disasters that have been occurring in the region. So for example, I'll just take you through a couple of them because I know I don't have a hang of a lot of time, but you'll notice that the bluish colors are really impacts or disasters that were caused by tropical cyclones, but you can see that in the more recent times, localized flooding has become an issue. So a kind of a shifting, so you're still having the major tropical cyclones occurring, but this localized flooding is becoming an issue requiring an intervention, largely because you're working in high densified areas. The other sets of indicators I just want to pick out, or the cases, you'll notice that drought is quite silent on that continuum, and some of us who've been in this game for a long time say, watch this space. This government, by the way, if you think about it, has never had to handle a major drought. like we had in the past. So we've had interior droughts, if you like, but never a major drought that requires us to interact with the SADC region. But more interestingly, if you look at the pink blocks, the disaster picture has changed, and cholera has become a major issue in the region as people start moving and migrating. We would have never have come to this picture if we'd come in just with our climate lenses on. We would have stuck, I think, with drought, floods, and heat waves. But by waking ourselves up and by working with others, we started to get a different picture. So if you read some of the other folk who are working in water around this, if you look at other communities of practice, they argue, and a lot of Australian work is really exciting in this field. The first statement is not rocket science. Yes, there are multiple stressors. Yes, there's HIV/AIDS, land tenure issues, and yes, the work that Shiona and others are doing to bring that up to the agenda is really important. But having worked in the field for so long, I get kind of frustrated. I want to well, so now what do we do? How do we think? And what ISON has been working on is very much like what Karen was talking about, is how do we get out of our traditions of practice? How do we get out of our own kind of paradigmatic biases that tend to make us go and look for the same data sets, the same communities of practice? And I'd just like to read you this very quickly. When a tradition becomes a blind spot, like Karen spoke about, so I'm not talking about traditional knowledge, I'm talking about how we as scientists, our tradition of practice, when we stop looking back, and I think as you get older, you look back more and more and more, we no longer appraise the value of a set of practices, our mental furniture that we've been rearranging over time. And I would argue that's been preventing our action. So what began, ISON says, as a wonderful idea of working with extension agents and practitioners has actually evolved into a blind practice as a consequence of the loss of connectedness with the context, that very connectedness that gave us meaning in the first place. So some of us have been working in this field for a long, long time. We're very excited about all of this. Why am I talking about this? Because I think the opportunity is huge for us to move our tradition forward, really move it forward. For example, and this is a slide I've borrowed from Willem Landman, we've never before, I think, and Bruce might want to correct me and others who are doing the modeling, but never before are we starting to get this really good sense of forecasting going from nowcasts all the way out to decadal. So we've got really good science. Mark, Stafford, Smith, and Karen are now part of Future Earth. Never before have we started to rethink the global communities that are working on this, really trying to think about how research communities meet. And even our WMO grandfathers, who are sometimes slow to come into these debates, and I know this is being recorded, but I'm putting it out there, are also thinking about forecasting services. You would have thought services would have been on the agenda right up in the beginning. But anyway, the services are there now, thank the Lord. So when you look, and Willem Landman has got this is his perception, he's saying what's really interesting is never before, and the pointer's not working, but never before have we had such, in a sense, good science, really good science, which is that lightish blue line, and yet his perception is that the uptake has been decreasing. In other words, he's getting fewer and fewer people coming to the CSIR wanting to ask for his forecasts, wanting to ask for his work. So why is that happening? Why is the stage being set, the furniture's all there, and yet this gap is growing? And I think it goes to some of the debates we've been having this morning. So some of us in the room, Gina, Emma Archer, Bettina, Arrange, Shiona, a whole lot of us, and forgive me if I don't include you, but there's a range of us who've been trying to work with farmers, trying to get extension officers engaged around climate change. This was work I did in Natal, and the biggest issue was that the water was just leaking and leaking and leaking. That was for about 2 weeks, and government just weren't doing anything. So these farmers were saying, you know, forget about climate change, let's just fix the governance of that system. So it's not new stuff. If you look at the dates, I'd like you to look at the dates now as I go through the rest of this narrative. So here's early work where we actually went as well-meaning climate scientists to take our model, which we had done, to the community. And it was kind of, in a way, I think, really well-meaning. Interestingly enough, mostly it's women who do this, not the men, but it's quite, they provide the model, and then we take it. So we kind of become the handmaidens. But anyway, and off we go. And I think it's because we do kind of think a little bit more as nurturers, maybe Mother Earth types. But the point is we were still going in with a model. Our model was the model. Our tradition of practice was shaping as we engaged. I think we did lots of great stuff, but now on reflection, I think we might have missed a trick or two. So just to catch our breath a little bit, what have I been saying so far? I would argue that never before have we got the kind of science that we've got. Uncertainty is huge, but we're starting to really start fiddling with some application work. We've got some nice studies coming out around dam management and so on. But as Willem Landman says, who's the author of this slide, interestingly enough, at the very time that we've had all this advancement, we're starting to see a bit of a tapering off of the uptake. So a gentleman by the name of McCowan, who Mark indicated, Mark Stafford Smith last night said he's an elderly gentleman now, but I just want to read it. I hope you can see it. He says, and I've kind of reframed a little bit of it into my presentation. He says, a painful realization by scientists is that formal models, although sometimes valuable in research practice, simply are not always appropriate to the physical and social situated practice, in this case of farming, but it could be government practice and so on. By this interpretation, what is needed in the future is a form of engagement, which we've been hearing. Future Earth is also talking about engagement between communities, but notice the words, communities of systems practice, where communicative rationality, those of you who've read any of Habermas's work might find this interesting, is not distorted by scientists claiming a disproportionate influence due to special knowledge embodied in their scientific models. And that's the last quote that I really love. He writes, in a brave new world of systems practice, over 10 years ago, instead of primarily using their models to design best practice of decision support systems for managers, scientists may be invited by farmers and other land use stakeholders to bring their simulators of aspects of farming or whatever into projects to help to explore multiple consequences, and I've highlighted the word plural significances. So, how can we try and do some of this? I think some of you are not foreign, or this is not new stuff, but I've been very fortunate to be a visiting professor at Stellenbosch University, and I work with Mark Swilling and others, John van Breda, who are particularly working around transdisciplinarity. And what's quite interesting here is that what they are arguing is that perhaps our tradition has been too much of scientists moving into a space instead of really getting to know the field in which we're trying to engage. So they talk about problem solving, beyond disciplines, practice orientated. We've heard this all morning. But I really want to just spend a little bit of time, if I may, in case you're not familiar with this, because I think we're using these terms sometimes incorrectly, and we're comfortable in our traditional space. So a monodisciplinarity view would be, for example, you're a climate scientist, and that's great to do the blue science research, the blue sky research. But then as you go along, normally as you want to get into adaptation, you kind of can't work alone, so you have to work with someone else. So you tend to work with an anthropologist or a social scientist or a lawyer, but then you find you actually really have to start doing some interdisciplinarity and really talking about how you're framing the science. But the big buzz and the hardest transition for us is to move from here to here, because it's comfortable here. It's really cool to get your A-grade rating, because the only way you can get it, I think, with all due respect to those who are A-rated, is to stay here. But most of the fun science is happening here. But when you work in this domain, you end up working with multiple authors, and so it becomes really difficult. So this kind of science, believe you me, is hard to do. And what does transdisciplinary mean for me? It means doing all of the stuff that we're normally doing, but embedding it into the outside community. So you're starting up front when you design your proposals with the business scientists, with the government. You actually go out there and you listen to the kinds of problems that they want answered, etc. So I've been bashing on this for a long time, but when I hear the word bridge, I kind of want to have a bit of a hurl and a froth, because I don't think it's a bridge. I don't think we should be bridging at all. It's not a linear model of going basic to applied in this context. Obviously, there are other contexts, but really this multidisciplinarity moving into transdisciplinarity is messy. We've heard that word come up 3 times this morning. Karen and then Lisa mentioned it. So when you go down these paths, you can't write a nice proposal. You can't get a nice structure that you can take to your government or to your manager. So the key question as I go on with my discussion now is, I come back to McCowan's point. Whose model are we using? What meaning are you starting with? And I think Karen mentioned that quite a lot in her presentation this morning. So for some of us, this is not new, because this is action research, where you take a thematic area of concern, adaptation, and the point is you build in the pauses, either to look back on long time scales in your project, or just to reflect with the groups that you're working with, and you carry on spiraling down into the revised, notice the plan of action. So you haven't started your science with the plan up there and then gone out to get the stakeholders to rubber stamp your science. And it's a very big mind shift, I think, for us to undertake as scientists. But as I move to the end of my talk, I'm really fortunate to be working on a big USAID project with the award team who works on water primarily. And so what we're trying to do, and it's kind of a big ask, I think, is that we're trying to do the modeling like we've been doing, uncertainty, mediating through practice, trying to get a new discourse going, working with civil society, citizens. I'll come back to the curmudgeons in a minute. But at the same time, whilst we're doing that science, we're trying to mirror, that's the word they use in the literature, mirror that activity back to ourselves, so that we're constantly reflecting on our practice, our tradition, and our culture as scientists. And hopefully what we're going to try and do through this process, so it's a parallel process in the research, is to actually start to have a revised understanding of the discourse, the very thing Karen was talking about. How do you shift the discourse from there to there so that you can start embedding it naturally? And I'm going to pause so that you don't need to fiddle with the institutional architecture. Maybe you do. Maybe you need to do it once you've got to this point. Maybe you need a radical implosion of your institutional architecture. So it's quite a nice strategy that we're trying to do. So as I come to the end of my brief interjection, and really I've worked on this field for about 33 years. I think my kids think I'm insane. I know Bruce thinks I've lost the plot. Peter Johnson, when he saw me, I've just recently had an embolism, so it's a clot. He said, oh, here's my favorite clot. So at least I was favorite, but I'm still a clot. But anyway, having said that, I really do think it is time for us, if we want to move this adaptation agenda forward, we have to take on some of the stuff that Karen was talking and really start interrogating it into practice, but into our practice, not necessarily the practice out there always. And a gentleman by the name of Van Forrester, again, notice the date that he wrote this, 1992. It goes to Gerard's comment that he made earlier. Is this just not a recycling of same old debates? Am I a part of the universe, looking through a peephole upon an unfolding universe? Or am I a part of that universe, where whenever I act, I'm changing both myself and the universe? That's a big set of questions. So to begin to concluding, Mickey Glantz, 2007, urged us in designing early warning systems, and I think it's just a good analogy, it could be anything. But the normal way of what we do is we take our science, our models, and then we filter it down to this group out here who need this knowledge. They need our knowledge. And we do a little bit of indigenous knowledge, we tinker a bit, we do participatory rural appraisal, all valuable things. But I think the time has come, particularly because we've got social media, we've got crowdsourcing, we've got other ways of doing things, to start maybe, and all I'm doing is just suggesting, is it time to maybe turn that on its head, where we start from the community ourselves first, our own community of practice as scientists, and then the other communities that we may be engaging in to really shift that space to go forward. Because I honestly believe, and it's just my personal opinion, we can't keep going around that mountain. It's just, there's no traction, to be honest. And I think Willem is finding the same thing. So who are our potential co-creators? I would argue that indeed, as the previous interjection was made just before tea, it is other scientists, and we have to be humble. Sheila Jasanoff, who works at the Kennedy Institute, Harvard, she says we have to have technologies of humility. And it's hard for us as scientists to kind of put our stuff in a cupboard and just go and listen to someone else I'm married to an applied mathematician. Believe you me, he's doing adaptation, complex adaptive systems, all with mathematics, and I kind of look and I go, oh my God. But as he shows me all the formula, I think, oh, that's an interesting point. Maybe I could kind of look at it in the science here. Civic society, faith-based groups, I think we're missing a huge trick there, and I don't mean that in a negative or a condescending way. We've already heard about youth groups, government, formal and informal, and business. I don't think it's only formal business, but obviously the beer brewers and the millers and the big water providers and the Escoms are important, but we've got a growing SMME community in South Africa and in Africa that we need to be looking at. And Karen, I think, has been bringing up some of this other stuff which is really important: life coaches, social media experts, innovation hubs. Last week I was at a meeting in Pretoria at the Innovation Hub, and a young guy walked in and he said, he listened to all our science and he went, I don't know what the hang you're talking about, but it sounds all really cool. But he said, I'm going to take a risk, and he said, here's my innovation ideas that could help you. And I could see the scientists in the room, their eyes just glazing over, because they didn't want to go that route of innovation. And I don't know why it is, but I think sometimes we're quite precious about our science, and I think it's time to open up. And even the curmudgeons. Now, the curmudgeons, if you look up the dictionary, apparently is about grumpy old thinkers. Those who disagree with us, and some of us in the room know we've got a lot of grumpy old thinkers out there who keep shooting missiles at climate change. But I hope we're not going to become the grumpy old curmudgeons, where we stick to our tradition because it's safe. So as I conclude, what I've tried to show you in this evolution of a narrative comes from my experience of working in this field for about over 35 years. These are givens. There's several wicked problems, there are wicked challenges, but there are several opportunities. I think there are a number of fresh approaches, but we've got to go out there and look for them. They're not going to come to us. We've got to get off our high horses and go talk and really try and get inside some of that literature. But it'll mean maybe parking some of the pet hobbies that you have, or engaging with people and young students who want to do that. And I really believe strongly you have to move away from a linear dialogue approach. I'm not convinced dialoguing is going to work unless that dialoguing is coming right up front in the agenda setting. And finally, I think it goes to ideas and notions of inverted architectures, and to bash a couple of international scientific unions. I think it's working with rather than for citizens. I think it's a big difference. I'm not saying this is the uber science motto. Obviously, blue sky research is, you work in your laboratory and that's how it is. But I think in this field, we really need to shift our dialogue quite a lot. And our traditions and our furniture in our heads needs to be rearranged, or maybe we need to go shopping somewhere else. So I leave in my last point. There's a very nice video that's just come out from an agricultural IT conference. And if you have a look at it, it's a futures literacy kind of thing. It takes you into the future and then tracks back from the future. I think Jeff asked earlier, what are you adapting to? And it's a kind of really nice futures literacy exercise, but not, running with the foxes and the hares and all that, which is useful. This is really just trying to look more at the science of it. So thank you all very much for your patience, and I enjoyed being here. Thank you.